first started talking about story elements last week, we talked about something called rising action and falling action. Today we're going to be reading chapter 7. It's called Opposition, and that's kind of like the start of our rising action. We've learned all of our story elements, character setting, all of those things now. We're moving into what's happening with our characters, and it's called opposition. Mrs. Smith says the middle of the story can be the most boringest part. And I think she's right, because that's where sometimes some kids fall asleep when you have reading time. So she says the middle part is where you have to get to some opposition, which means things or people are against your character. Which was not a problem in this book, because larger-than-life Laura had so much opposition that it couldn't all fit in here. Or the story would be so long that nobody, not even Mrs. Smith, would ever want to read it. Mrs. Smith said that some famous writers, who I can't think of the name of right now, said, "It's a good book, but the covers are too far apart." Get it? Like the middle part of the book was way too big and fat? I don't want that thing to happen to me. And another writer, I can't remember, said, "Inside every big fat book is a skinny book waiting to come out." I'm not sure what that one means, but it made Mrs. Smith laugh. And it's true because a famous writer had said so. So, what you do then about opposition is you pick the biggest or the most interesting ones, and that's what I'm doing. I got to school Tuesday after Joey and before Laura. So I, along with most of the kids in my class, saw Joey Gilbert put a folded piece of paper on Laura's larger-than-life desk. Doing this made Maddie and Sarah and Amber giggle, so I figured that they knew more about this note than I did, which didn't surprise me none. Somebody would have had to help Joey spell those words, for the one thing. He was the worst speller in the whole class, if you didn't count Eric. Joey shot me this look that Matt, my meanest big brother, gives me when he thinks I might tell him on him. Only Joey's got a ways to go with that look. He should have known I'd never tell on anybody. I stay out of trouble, it's not mine. Laura was the last one to come in the classroom, and I was thinking about that if I was her, I'd be the first one so that I wouldn't have to walk down the side of the class. She didn't fit between the desk aisles and have everybody staring at me. But she smiled like she was so glad to be back and was having good memories of her first day at Paris Elementary. "Now then," Mrs. Smith began, "for our reading time today, we're going to start reading through Faraday. It's a fine little play written by a man who used to farm in this community." I watched out of the corner of my eye as Laura grunted into her desk. "We should finish reading the play tomorrow. If you're trying out for a part, I'll be passing out copies of the tryout portions of the script tomorrow. But don't forget that everyone will have a part in our production." She went into her routine about lighting and making the background and decorating the stage, that they were all as good as being a star on the stage. I missed a lot of the speech because I was watching Laura unfold her note. "Excuse me, class." This was Mrs. Smith's way of saying shut up, although sometimes she just said that. "Would someone care to tell me what's so interesting that you can't pay attention to me?" I glanced around the room. Kids were creeping out of their seats and stretching to see what Laura was going to do about Joey's note. "You know how I feel about passing notes in class," Mrs. Smith said, stretching her arm out to Laura. We did know. Mrs. Smith, if she caught you passing notes, she'd collect them and read them all in front of God and everybody. Even when it was notes between Maddie and Tommy or some other boy, and they were so mushy and gross. And everyone would go, "Yuck, gross, give me a break." Since I sat right next to Laura, I had already gotten me a good look at Joey Gilbert's note. And I was pretty sure Mrs. Smith wasn't going to read it out loud. I can't remember every single word of that note, and I can't guarantee I got the words in the right order, but it went something like this. "To larger-than-life Laura, you should be the pig in our play about Faraday. Only pigs aren't as fat as you are, and they're a heck of a lot prettier, too. Why don't you go back to the pig pen where you belong? Joey." I don't know why Joey would have signed the note. He's stupid, but not that stupid. I thought maybe whoever did the spelling for Joey made sure to sign Joey's name so that the speller wouldn't get in trouble. Laura still hadn't handed over the note to Mrs. Smith, whose arm was still reaching for it. Instead, Laura folded the note, then she folded it again. If I didn't think Mrs. Smith would get after me for using a cliche, I would have said that in our classroom, you could have heard a pin drop. That's how quiet it had gotten. Cliches are saying that it gets too much. Are sayings that get too much use and people get sick and tired of them. That's what our teacher says, and she doesn't like them one bit. When the note was folded as small as it would get, Laura smiled up at Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith put down her arm, her forehead wrinkled up just like an even older person's, and her head tilted to one side because you could tell that she just didn't get what was going on. Then Laura said, "Hey, Mrs. Smith, do you mind if I keep my note?" "Laura, you don't have to take this," Mrs. Smith began. She turned to Joey Gilbert, who scurried back into his chair. "Joey, I've seen enough to know this note is your doing. This is inexcusable. You and I have to have a little talk with the principal and—" "Mrs. Smith," Laura interrupted, so calm and peaceful that Mrs. Smith stopped talking and her wrinkles went back to the normal ones. "Could I just say something to Joey instead of you and the principal doing it?" "What?" asked our teacher. Laura didn't repeat it. She just kept smiling. Finally, Mrs. Smith's head nodded yes. Laura got herself up out of her desk, which I'm telling you was no small thing to do. Then she turned to the back of the room and she smiled directly at Joey. If you thought it was quiet in our room before when you could have heard the pin drop, well, you should have heard it now. You could have heard a feather drop. In my head, tried to imagine what I would have said if I had been larger than life, Laura, and had gotten me a mean note that had called me a pig. And first off, I figured that I would have to let Mrs. Smith and Principal Russell have at Joey. Then I would have taken him out on recess. I know this to be true because it's already happened to me 2 times. But he didn't call me a pig, just Hillbilly Jill and stuff like that. But not Laura. That smile never left her face the whole time, and here's what Laura said. "Hey, Joey Gilbert, thanks for the note. In a class clown election, you'd get my vote. I watched you pitch, and I think you're great, but you'll get more power if your arm is straight." Then, larger-than-life Laura sat down. Nobody, not even Mrs. Smith, said nothing while Laura lowered herself back into her chair and scooched her body the rest of the way into it and pulled her folding table desk as close as it would get to her larger-than-life stomach. Mrs. Smith started to say something like, "Well, Laura, that was..." Then changed her mind and started over with Joey. "Joey, I never want you..." Again. But she gave up trying to solve the opposition in another way from what Laura had done, and she went back to talking about the play. A normal person who just got out of having to go to the principal's office for the 100 millionth time instead of just got himself a pretty good rhyming poem that called him a class clown and a great baseball player, plus gave him good advice on pitching, would have been happy or maybe even grateful. But Joey Gilbert is no normal person, and I had a feeling that he wasn't happy even one little bit about the things and how they had turned out. I didn't turn around to look at Joey until Mrs. Smith started to read the Fair Day play to us. But when I did, it didn't take one look to know I was right. Joey Gilbert was not happy. His eyes were slanty. His mouth had made a hard line. He was squeezing his pencil so hard it was a miracle that it hadn't broken up into pieces. Mrs. Smith said about opposition that it's boring when the opposition happens and then it gets all over right away. That it's better when the opposition just keeps growing and growing and gets bigger and bigger. That one look at Joey Gilbert made me know for sure that this opposition wasn't the getting over fast kind. His was the growing bigger and bigger kind, like larger than life opposition.